let me, you've diagnosed some of the, especially Hassan, some of the serious internal problems and rifts and the difficulty of forming a Lebanese project given, given the current situation. I wonder if we can just, all of you, speculate specifically on the different contingencies you see for Lebanon, for good or for ill, of the Syrian situation, of the Assad regime disappearing in one way or another. What is the likely impact on Lebanon of different scenarios that are most likely?
Should I take that?
Sure.
Iran has invested plenty in its client in Lebanon. Iran has put in a lot of money. It is actually the flagship of Iranian power globally. It is the vector through which Iran, up until the Arab Spring, was able to penetrate quite a few Arab markets with ideas and with slogans and with soft power, hopefully leading to hard power. Iran is unlikely to let that investment go to waste. Iran has already, with Hezbollah, taken steps in order to ensure that it is not wasted that fast. The fact that once Syria started to agitate, Lebanon loses its government is no accident. The fact that Hezbollah now controls far more of the Lebanese state than it would have liked to, because actually it benefited quite a bit from the duality of states that existed, meaning as a shadow state, let the official state serve as a shield. I mean, we talk about human shields. Here we have really a state shield. You shield yourself, and actually it worked very well for them in 2006, when effectively the Israeli army was unable to do what the Israeli army could have done, which is eradicate Hezbollah, because there was another Lebanon there that the Israeli army could not eradicate and was not supposed to eradicate, and therefore lost its bid. Now, I think, therefore, what we have here is a situation in which Hezbollah owns more of Lebanon than it would have wanted to, but out of necessity, exactly in order to account for the contingency of the loss of Syria as a conduit. What would happen if Syria, if the new Syria is hostile to Hezbollah? That's a problem, because finding ways of resupply for Hezbollah is going to be an issue, and therefore we might get to a point where Iran will be faced with the choice of either letting that investment dissolve into nothingness or using it at one point or another. And the likelihood of it using it, therefore, might be more interesting from its point of view.
Tony, do you have?
Well, one of the interesting things that we saw in recent weeks is this kidnapping of so-called Shiite pilgrims in northern Syria. And this has been a major issue between the leadership of Hezbollah and the sort of the Syrian opposition writ large, because of the various speeches that Hassan Nasrallah gave on the issue that were very antagonistic towards the Syrian opposition, which ended up delaying the negotiations over the release of these kidnapped Lebanese Shiites in Syria, who remain abducted to this day. What's interesting, though, is that in one of his speeches, Nasrallah actually sort of made a plea to no longer use the land route in Syria anymore with buses. Use airplanes, he said. Now think about that also logistically in terms of supplies. I mean, it foretells kind of what would happen, not just if the Sunnis were empowered in Syria, but even if Syria were to descend into chaos where you'd have sort of rules of militias able to intercept this, even just for money, just didn't negotiate over money, you know, be it with Hezbollah and so on. And the fact that they sort of, it brought his prestige down because now he has to negotiate with them, he's not capable of securing their release and so on and so forth. So you already are starting to see the kind of repercussions of what would happen already in the situation now. But Hassan brought up, you know, a very good point about the Iranian investment. The problem with the Iranian investment is that it's got sort of almost contradictory tenets, right? On the one hand, it's a larger project for the expansion of Iranian influence in the region, and it always was. But on the other hand, it's also a very specifically military investment, meaning not just as an arm for overseas operations for the Iranians, which this is exactly what Hezbollah has been, but also specifically as it relates to the nuclear issue, as sort of a retaliatory option or second strike option, right? But the problem is that you can use this once, and the change in doctrine by the Israeli military since the 2006 war to today, and they've been preemptively saying that openly, the military leadership in Israel, is that the devastation this time around is going to be total. So any village now that serves as a logistical hub for Hezbollah will be treated as a military target. So they will restraints as it was in 2006, where there was a deliberate attempt to sort of keep, in keeping with the Bush administration's pressures on the one hand, but also the remnants of the doctrine of the 90s, which sort of tried to keep a sort of a tit-for-tat military confrontation with Hezbollah. That's gone now. So if this is another sort of wild card in the situation that has nothing to do with what happens in Syria and what happens with Iran, which is what Amal also briefly touched on. And I think these two things are very contradictory. On the one hand, you want an element of influence in Hezbollah, a long-term investment, but on the other hand, it has a military function, and that military function risks, should it be used, to lead to the complete devastation of that. And the loss of Syria only will complicate Iran's ability to rebuild it.
Okay. I think we've got about 35 minutes or so. Lots of tremendous expertise here in the audience, people from the administration, from Capitol Hill, media, think tanks. So let's get your questions. Raise your hand. I'll try and recognize you in order. Ask that you state your name and affiliation, and keep your comments and questions as short as possible. Eli Lake.
Thanks. Eli Lake, Newsweek Daily Beast. This is for the panel. In light of Hezbollah's influence and more control in the Lebanese army particularly, what is the status now of U.S. military assistance to the Lebanese army, and what should it be, given these new political facts?
The American assistance to the Lebanese army is continuing. There was a period of time when they stopped the lethal weapon delivery, but recently they had released it, and I think the program is going very well. And I think even this week in town we have a delegation, military delegation from Lebanon, having talks with their American counterparts. I think it's going well, and I think it should continue, because the Lebanese army is still the only national institution that can safeguard the safety and security in Lebanon. And I think this assistance is very vital to have a counter force to Hezbollah, no matter how small compared to Hezbollah's power. But it's very important to have that as the sovereign army for the country at this time. It's very important to continue that aid.
It's a Faustian arrangement of sorts, meaning the Hezbollah's influence in the army is such that it is calculated to be up to a level where it would still be logical and appropriate for the Americans to continue the support. So they do not cross that line. But because the army is needed, as Amal is mentioning, as a stabilizing force in Lebanon. But ultimately, the situation is not tenable long term. Either there is the emergence of a Lebanese political power that is able to one way or another deal with the fact that there is a state within the state, actually beyond the state, or for that matter, what we're talking about is really we're moving on the way with regard to the army, on the way to a total control of the army by Hezbollah.
Right. I mean, this is the issue. I mean, to talk about the army as a national institution, I think the Sheikh Abdul Wahid that was murdered, I think, would dispute that. I mean, I think there's a serious penetration, not just by Hezbollah. I mean, by Hezbollah's allies in Michel Aoun's movement, who have good penetration in military intelligence as well, and they work together. And it's so I think there are limits. Obviously, a lot of the officer corps also comes from Akkar. A lot of them are from sort of the Sunni regions as well. So there are limits as to how much penetration Hezbollah can have of the military. But as we've seen, and as they're trying to do now, is pretty much to use the military as the front in which to contain the Sunni community's support of the Syrian revolution in places like Tripoli and Akkad and the Bekaa in Arsel. But it's going to be sort of a very fine balancing act for the military. The leader of the head of the commander of the army is, as everybody in Lebanon who's Maronite, has presidential ambitions. So he will have to walk a very fine line in catering to Hezbollah and even Assad to a certain extent, although more Hezbollah than Assad, because that's where the power lies on the one hand, and on the other hand, in order to to be mildly sort of attractive as an option to the Sunni community, which feels directly targeted by the Lebanese army. So I mean, and that's really part of Hezbollah's plan. I mean, to put the Sunni community in a clash with the army. And so far, the army hasn't performed well. And I think that the administration would do well to sort of, if it has any leverage in that sense on the conduct of the army in that way, that now's the time to use it.
Thanks. Right over here. Sorry.
Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. A while back we heard that that Syria or Iran through Syria had provided Hezbollah with Scud missiles, but I've never seen any confirmation of that. And I was wondering whether any of you on the panel can actually confirm that they did receive Scud missiles.
Rumors run plenty. So I hear rumors that in Hermel, which is in northern Lebanon, underground Scud missiles are buried. You hear rumors that no, they're still in Syria, but now they have. When we say that Syria has provided that Hezbollah has taken possession of the weapons, but they're still in Syria, manned by Hezbollah in Syria. But really, I think this is not a question that can be settled in open source. You'll have to go to intelligence and somewhere else.
Anybody else? Tony, Mal, on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear. Like I said, like Hassan said, there were plenty of reports and rumors. I mean, you can't verify them. But one of the things that also came out is that whether it was Scud-Ds or whether it was the Fatah, the sort of the M110, I think is called, the kind of missile that's has a shorter range, but still can hit very deeply in Israel. And whether that was in fact the missile that was smuggled as opposed to a Scud-D. Israeli intelligence from leaks in the media as well. This is all open source stuff. Tend to lean towards the M110 theory more than although nobody has discounted the Scuds at all. But there's also other stuff that they got the Yachont anti-naval missiles as well, and they seem to have gotten those as well. And so they have plenty of other stuff, not just the Scud that could do damage.
And Nasrallah has actually spoken publicly about his capability to cover all of Israel.
Correct, but that's so. Which one would the range? Could be debatable because it depends on the point that you're firing it from Lebanon.
Right, but the 110 is quite a capable.
Yes, absolutely.
Missile
that can hit
all
quite deep in the south.
Yeah. Right here, the gentleman in the behind, and then Joe Gibelli.
Hi, Mr. Oren Durrell from USA Today. Mr. Mneimneh, you mentioned something about a Somaliland in al-Qaeda Somaliland up in north of that Lebanon. And I was kind of wondering how would that, expound on that a little bit and tell us how that would
You hold the mic up a little closer.
Change the situation in the whole balance of power in the region over there.
Again, this is speculation, but it is let's call it informed speculation. But the regime in Syria seems to be operating with Plan A and Plan B, with an implicit conviction that Plan A is not going to work, and therefore Plan B is going to be the real option. Plan A is the restoration of regime power over all of Syria. This is why we have those roving massacres committed by the same combination of troops and recruits. But Plan B is the consolidation of power in an area that may or may not end up be subject to ethnic cleansing. Some of the massacres that we've seen lately in Syria very much so indicate that there is an attempt at creating fear in the midst of a population that happened to be Sunni to leave certain areas, with all sorts of smoke screen being created in order to preserve that deniability. The fact of the matter, in Lebanon and within the regime in Syria, you still have the rather absurd notion that it is possible, maybe not that probable, but it is possible nonetheless with a respectable level of possibility for the regime to not only restore its power, but to regain its international credibility. And very often the argument is in the form of, well, you know what, Russia had Chechnya, China had Tiananmen Square, the United States had Waco, and we have had minor problems here and there. Well, regardless of how absurd that is, there seems to be another strain within the regime that says, let us consolidate nonetheless in that area that extends from the Lebanese border to the Turkish border of Hatay. And that area has to be under strict control, and this is why you have what we're witnessing in them. Again, this is informed speculation, which is disastrous because it will leave the rest of Syria in a state similar to the lawlessness in Somalia, with the area that I'm talking about being provided with some level of state control or of leadership control in the form of the leftovers of the Ba'athist regime, which, by the way, I underline here, I personally do not think of it as a Alawi regime. It does not contain all of the Alawi community, nor is it limited to the Alawis. But it will have, it has an advantage in moving to Alawi territory because clearly it has tried to ignite, if you'd like, a sectarian warfare in Syria in order to secure a base. It is exactly like Zarqawi did in Iraq. Zarqawi in Iraq tried to kill Shias in order to have the Shias kill Sunnis in order for the Sunnis to rally around him. Here we have a regime that is effectively trying to corner the Alawis into feeling and thinking that either you're with us or you're dead.
Joe.
Joe Jabil, Lebanese Information Center. The question is for all, including John. What would you like to see Washington doing at this point regarding Lebanon? Especially, I mean, we spoke about the LAF, but we know that Washington has access to, let's say, many in government, including the Prime Minister, Jumblat, and others. So what would you like them to do at this point regarding the situation in Lebanon?
The United States is till today is still supporting stability in Lebanon. And yesterday the Secretary of State called the Prime Minister and emphasized that it's important for stability in Lebanon. They have concerns about the north. I think the United States can continue helping Lebanon by putting Lebanon back on the front burner and not putting it on the back burner as now, because now only they are concerned when Lebanon is creating problems, when things are erupting up. I think it's very important to keep Lebanon as an important issue in Washington and have a focus on Lebanon, because the time when people are not looking, lots of bad things happen in Lebanon. And when the United States is not showing that it's very interested and it's really involved in Lebanon, the other parties misinterpret that as not interest or supporting their agenda in Lebanon. And we see lots of examples of that lately, that if the United States is not saying anything, it means they are supporting, and I hear a lot and see a lot in the pro-Hezbollah press in Lebanon that the United States supports the stability in Lebanon that Hezbollah is having, that the government is having, which means they don't care about Lebanon. What they care is about stability, and they don't care about Lebanon anymore. I think the reaffirmation of the U.S. policy of supporting Lebanon's independence and sovereignty and the democracy movement in Lebanon has to remain on the front burner in Washington. The messages should not be misunderstood international support for stability in Lebanon should not be misunderstood as support for the status quo in Lebanon, which basically relies on the power of Hezbollah and its allies in the government. So I think the most important thing the Americans can do is try to show that interest in Lebanon and not leave Lebanon on the back burner. I understand there's so many overwhelming issues that the United States has to deal with now, and so much we can focus on. But Lebanon is very important and central to leave it for just the times when there are eruptions that you can interfere. Thank you.
The problem with this is that Amal is right. I mean, the problem is that the al-Akhbar sort of propaganda, if you want to call it that, in the pro-Hezbollah papers propaganda, is that, in a sense, it's right. I mean, ultimately, the U.S. interest in Lebanon is pretty much to just keep it nice and quiet, and nothing else. Because the reason for the problem in the policy is that there is really strategic confusion as to what the United States wants, even in Syria. If the United States wants to support, does the United States actually want to support the Syrian opposition to get lethal aid through neighboring countries or not? If so, then the idea of keeping Lebanon stable becomes a problem, because you don't know whether it's going to be stable or not, because it might lead to clashes, which is what we saw in Tripoli. On the other hand, if you don't want Lebanon to be part of that sort of logistical effort, then de facto you are, I mean, okay, you find yourself in the same position as Hezbollah, right? Trying to hide behind the Lebanese army as a stabilizing force. But the Lebanese army is not a neutral force in this case. So it becomes a contradictory policy, because there is no real clarity on what the United States and how the United States wants to go about seeing a change in Syria. And I think as long as that's the case, the Lebanese policy is going to remain just as confused.
I agree about the primacy of the Syrian issue in that respect. I think we as Americans have, I mean the administration, but also I would argue even American civil society have to a large extent ignored what the gravity of what's happening in Syria, not just from the point of view of the victims, not just from the point of view of the atrocities that are being committed, but of the potential ripple effect on the region. Not only Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, and beyond, frankly. I would venture to say that here is where Russian and American interests meet, because the collapse of Syria will have ripple effect all the way to Kazakhstan and all the way across the Arab world too. But I think for matters of principle, not necessarily for cynicism, for matters of principle, the Obama administration, which has committed itself to adhere to an international legality regimen in terms of dealing with issues of the sort, has been unable, is an impasse, has given effectively power to Russia to say no. And Russia is saying no, and Russia is enjoying the new power that it has. There's no equivalence between American power and Russian power. I cannot think of any instance in history in which, I mean in recent history, in which the US has decided to act and Russia objected and was able to materialize its objection into actual resistance to the American intent. I think we need to have moral clarity first and foremost, but also clarity with regard to our interest. I think the test for the Obama administration is for it to realize that the framework that it has imposed upon itself, that outside of the international legitimacy that is provided by the United Nations Security Council, there cannot be action, is not suitable, has proven that in this case has reached an impasse. If and when we do this, that strategy will have to include a serious accounting for what Lebanon is going to suffer in consequence. But I do not think that it is realistic to ask an administration that is unable to conceive of a Syrian strategy to have a Lebanese strategy. So I think it's more a question of please keep on doing the same, because at least it is, I mean, do not abandon us in a certain sense.
It's always, I just say a couple of words, it's always seemed to me that the United States' capability at this point in the 21st century to actually try and fix what ails Lebanon internally is quite limited, and the real American value added to these situations is always to try and as best we can, create a regional and international context in which the threats and dangers and risks to Lebanon state are minimized, and the space for Lebanese themselves to come together on behalf of a Lebanese project are maximized. And it seems to me that, again, this is another way of saying that the failure on the American part to date, at least, to find a coherent strategy to address Syria in the first instance, and the overriding problem and tensions with Iran, that Lebanon will continue to sort of fall in between those cracks and continue to be at some significant greater risk than it otherwise would be if in fact such an American strategy existed. Yeah, right over here in the front.
Hi, my name is Casey Krolchek, and I'm from the American Friends of UNRWA. And I was wondering if the panel could comment on how changing dynamics in Lebanon may be affecting or are affecting Palestinian refugees in Lebanon.
Let's, again, when I speak of, when you talked about the downtrodden of Bibi Tabbani, the reason that Salafism was able to be attractive to them is because they were able to see that we are as neglected as those fellow Sunnis who are in Palestinian camps. And actually, those fellow Sunnis in Palestinian camps, remember that when Nahr al-Barid happened and Fatah al-Islam, through the machination of the Syrian regime, let's make it clear, took over Nahr al-Barid, and Nahr al-Barid was devastated as a result and had to move. They did not demand the return to Palestine. They demanded the return to Nahr al-Barid. There's very much so today localized identities. So Palestinians in Lebanon are actually, in more ways than one, a dying breed, because anyone who can leave is leaving. I mean, it's enough suffering being Palestinian. Being Palestinian in Lebanon is triple suffering, because you suffer being a Palestinian, you suffer with the Lebanese for what Lebanon is about, and then you suffer because of the Lebanese, because they discriminate against you and they mistreat you, etc. So that triple suffering is not an interesting proposition for anyone, and therefore, really, it's ultimately a question, meaning the Lebanon has to face up to the fact, Lebanese society has to face up to the fact that it has mistreated its Palestinian population in ways that are really shameful. But beyond that, I tell you, meaning the suffering that I described to you is not that much different from what other communities will complain about.
I have something about this. I agree with him that the Lebanese should really do more to help the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And there were some attempts at the Prime Minister's office when Mr. Hariri was in government, and Mr. Senura, to try to put a comprehensive plan for helping them in the camps and try to improve their social and economic. And actually, there is a person in the Prime Minister's office now established an office for helping the Palestinian refugees and try to. But the most important thing that's happening now that could affect their fate is that the movement last week of Mr. Ahmed Jibril, the PFLP leader. He's been seen meeting Mr. Assad. He was meeting Mr. Najad in Tehran, and he visited Lebanon, so Mr. Nasrallah. There's a fear that the PFLP could be used again to stir troubles in Lebanon if the situation now deteriorates, and because, as you know, that they have military camps in Lebanon. The PFLP still has military camps in Mneimneh, on the coast, and on the Syrian-Lebanese border. And these arms in these camps have been subject of the dialogue in Lebanon, and they agreed in the former sessions of dialogue that this problem should be resolved and they should be disarmed, but nothing happened. I think if the Palestinians let themselves be used as a tool again in the Lebanese and Syrian conflict against the Lebanese, I think this will reflect negatively on them, and this would be a tragedy again for the Palestinians in Lebanon, because they will pay a price. And I hope this will not happen, because I think the Palestinians have had enough of their own share of suffering in Lebanon and elsewhere. So I think this is the danger now on the Palestinians. If the Palestinians again become a tool and play a role in the internal situation in Lebanon against part of the Lebanese.
Any other questions? Yes, this lady.
Hi. Hello. My name is Yara Zghaib, and I work for the International Center of Religion and Diplomacy.
Could you speak up, please, a little bit?
Can you hear me now? Is this
Just
better?
project your voice a little
Okay.
bit. Yeah.
I could just shout, but yes. So the question I want to ask is, I was hoping that you would address the issue of the natural gas resources off the coast of Lebanon, especially since we're talking about the future. And it's very interesting that none of you brought this up. And that's actually a point of concern amongst many of the Lebanese people living here in Washington, is that while we're all looking towards Syria and fighting amongst ourselves, trying to decide who we're supporting, whether we're with the opposition or whether we're supporting the government, we have this issue of all these resources that have been found off our coast that other countries like Israel and Cyprus and Turkey are very focused on and very interested in, and that could have a tremendous impact on the future of Lebanon, which is what this panel is about. But we just don't seem to be giving it enough attention. And what are the risks of us doing that?
I mean, I did, at one point in one of my articles, I did address this, in that but you cannot separate it, unfortunately, from what's happening in Syria. Because if you remember, I think, what was it, June of last year or the year before that, when Bashar al-Assad summoned the minister, Basil, to Damascus, and leaned on him to give no, it was June of last year, because it had already started, the fighting in Syria, and leaned on him to give a no-bid contract to Russian companies to develop these gas fields. And this is leaving aside the Hezbollah issue in all of this because of the demarcation of the border and what that signifies and all of that. But what was interesting in this is that, I speculated at the time whether this, this indeed is, is Bashar al-Assad basically trying to pay the Russians with Lebanese money, pretty much, because, and this is an interest for the Russians, because the Russians very much want to maintain monopoly on this business, especially now that they've been cut out with the Israel-Cyprus deals as well. So this way, it gives them a window to remain a player in the gas. I mean, that's the other thing. They have weapons and they have gas. That's what Russia's projection of power is usually about. So they wanted, I speculated that they may want a piece of that, and that maybe trying to get through Lebanon. But ultimately, I don't see this being developed now, not just because of the situation, with regard to Syria, but I think ultimately this is a Hezbollah issue, and Hezbollah is not. It's too complicated because it's entangled with border demarcations and having to deal with the Israeli element of that as well. So I think to keep it as is, as a festering file, as it were, is pretty much how it's probably going to stay for a while now.
Well, we have had a little bit of a dereliction of duty on the part of the Lebanese government when it comes to the maritime demarcation. As you know, there are more than one formula on how to demarcate, and the Leviathan field in particular could fall, I think, if not in its totality, in its majority, within the Lebanese jurisdiction under one formula. But we have not advocated that. The Lebanese government has not advocated it. It chose instead to be silent and to say we do not negotiate with Israel. In the process, Israelis and Cypriots and Turks, for that matter, have effectively, with no contest, have their agreements in place. Well, the cynical way to look at it is to say that indeed this is another Sheba Farms. Keep in mind, no one knew of Sheba Farms up until the withdrawal happened, and then all of a sudden it became such an existential national issue that we cannot live without Sheba Farms, and we have to put as hostage all of our history for Sheba Farms. The cynical way is to look at it that in this angle, but really I prefer the other way of looking at it. It's sheer incompetence, and the fact that the return, because we're talking here about capital investment, and we're not about something that can produce income in any reasonable amount of time that is for anyone in power to say, well, I'll be able to benefit from it. So this is why it becomes part of, it gets postponed, and there's the direction of duty. If we did not have this consumption with absolutely fictional issues in Lebanon, civil society in Lebanon would be demanding accountability on why our national interest has not been cared for on the part of our government. But we prefer instead to focus on whether some slight of a statement from here or from there was rude or not, or whatever, meaning as you know.
Can I have just a quick?
Yeah,
very quickly. I think it's partially right because there has been focus on it in Lebanon. Nabi Berri this is the most important issue for him now, and there's Fred Hoff is working very hard on the demarcation on this issue because there's a dispute now between Lebanon, Cyprus, and Israel on this, and there's an effort underway to try to solve that problem. And but you're right about the other point.
But Lebanon certainly needs all the help it can get economically. We haven't touched on it much today, but one has to assume that this year the summer tourist season is going to be quite hard hit. There's also, I must say, at least what I pick up, ongoing concerns about the Lebanese financial system, which is, of course, critical to Lebanon's economy, and the possible abuse of the Lebanese financial system, and concerns the United States government has had in the past about Syrian money in particular, but even Iranian money perhaps flowing through some Lebanese banks and circumventing sanctions, but that's a topic for another day. Amal, I know you had some thoughts on border issues. We had this fight over whether...
I just have something amusing for you guys, because there's a lot of talk about the smuggling of arms from Lebanon to Syria, and the Syrian government is making a big deal about it. And this is the first time actually in history of the conflict over the border between Lebanon and Syria that the complaint is from the Syrian part, usually. So I'm going to read to you something. It's interesting. This is Resolution 128, 1958, the United Nations resolution. It says, the Security Council, having heard the charges of the representative of Lebanon concerning interference by the United Arab Republic, which means Syria and Egypt at that time, in the internal affairs of Lebanon, and the reply of the representative of the United Arab Republic, decides to dispatch urgently an observation group to proceed to Lebanon so as to ensure that there is no illegal infiltration of personnel or supply of arms or other material across the Lebanese border. Second, authorize the Secretary General to take the necessary steps to that end. Third, request the observation group to keep the Security Council currently informed through the Secretary General. Adopted on the 825th meeting by 10 votes to none with 1 abstention. It's the Soviet Union. So I think history repeats itself. At that time, Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, had the observation team. They were there for 6 months, and then they decided at the end of the there was no arms transfer from Syria to Lebanon. And then we had the Levant in the last 5 years ago, also to observe the border. And so this is an issue that has been going on since the establishment of that border. And the March 14 and the Lebanese had been calling forever for demarcation of the border, and it was Syria that was not demarcating the border. So they should have demarcated that border. Thank you. Thank you.
Do we have anybody, a last question from anybody? Okay, otherwise I'll bring us to an early close. I want to thank the panelists for a terrific discussion. Thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.
And have a terrific weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.